The morning of March 15th, 2012, found Randy Travis staring out the window of his Nashville home, watching the rain streak down the glass like tears he refused to shed. The country music legend who had once commanded stadiums filled with adoring fans now faced a reality that seemed as gray as the Tennessee sky. His career, which had soared to incredible heights in the 80s and 90s, had been stumbling for years like a wounded animal limping toward an uncertain destination. The tabloids were relentless, documenting every misstep, every canceled show, every sign that the man who had helped define modern country music was losing his grip on both his career and his life. The house around him stood as a monument to better times, a sprawling estate in the affluent Belmead neighborhood that he had purchased during the peak of his success in 1987. Every room held memories of parties with fellow musicians, recording sessions that lasted until dawn, and quiet moments with his guitar when inspiration struck like lightning. The living room walls were adorned with platinum albums, Grammy Awards, and photographs that documented a career spanning 3 decades. Images of him with George Jones, Tammy Wynette, Dolly Parton, and countless other legends served as constant reminders of the heights he had once reached and the distance he had fallen. Randy's reflection in the window showed a man weathered by time and circumstance. His face, once smooth and youthful when he first stepped onto the Grand Ole Opry stage at 23 years old, now carried lines that spoke of battles fought and sometimes lost. The morning light revealed tired eyes that had seen too much success and too much failure. Eyes that had witnessed the intoxicating rush of sold-out concerts and the devastating emptiness of canceled tours. His hair, once jet black and carefully styled for television appearances and magazine covers, had turned salt and pepper, and he no longer bothered with the pomade and styling products that had once been essential to his public image. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain against the windows and the occasional creak of settling wood. His housekeeper had stopped coming 3 months ago when he could no longer afford her services, and the cleaning lady had followed shortly after. The mansion that had once bustled with activity, managers coming and going, musicians gathering for impromptu jam sessions, friends dropping by for barbecues and pool parties, now felt like a mausoleum dedicated to a life that no longer existed. Randy had been living in relative isolation for the past 18 months, avoiding the public eye that had once been his greatest ally, but had become his harshest judge. The phone calls from his manager had become less frequent, each conversation more difficult than the last as they discussed dwindling opportunities and mounting debts. The recording offers had dried up completely, with record labels unwilling to take risks on an artist whose personal problems had overshadowed his musical talent. The invitations to perform at major venues had all but disappeared, replaced by occasional offers to play at small clubs and county fairs that felt more like charity than legitimate bookings. His morning routine had become a ritual of avoidance and delay. He would wake up late, often after noon, having spent the previous evening nursing a bottle of whiskey and watching old concert footage on his laptop. The first hour of consciousness was always the hardest, that moment when reality crashed over him like a cold wave and he remembered exactly where his life had ended up. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, the same machine he had used for 15 years, one of the few constants in a life that had become increasingly unstable and unpredictable. The kitchen table was cluttered with unopened mail, most of it bills and legal documents that he was afraid to examine too closely. Foreclosure notices from the bank, letters from creditors, and correspondence from lawyers painted a picture of financial ruin that seemed impossible for someone who had once sold millions of records. The irony was not lost on him that the same hands that had once signed autographs for thousands of fans were now reluctantly signing documents that stripped away pieces of his former life. The decision to take the train to Atlanta that afternoon was not born of choice but necessity, another reminder of how far his circumstances had fallen from the days when he traveled by private jet or luxury tour bus. His driver's license had been suspended after a series of incidents that had made headlines across the country music world and beyond. The most recent incident, involving a traffic stop where he had been found naked and intoxicated in his car, had been the final straw for both the authorities and his remaining fans. The details of that night were still hazy in his memory, a blur of alcohol, confusion, and the kind of poor judgment that had become all too common in his life. The humiliation of having to rely on public transportation felt like another nail in the coffin of his dignity, another reminder that his independence and status had been stripped away piece by piece. He remembered the days when his travel arrangements were handled by a team of assistants, when his every need was anticipated and accommodated. Now he was responsible for booking his own train ticket, finding his own way to the station, and navigating the complexities of public transportation like any ordinary citizen. The meeting in Atlanta was with his lawyer, Marcus Reynolds, a conversation he had been avoiding for weeks but could no longer postpone. There were legal matters to resolve, contracts to renegotiate, and the difficult task of trying to salvage what remained of his career and reputation. Marcus had been with him for over a decade, representing him through various contracts, endorsement deals, and the occasional legal scrape. Now their relationship had shifted from managing success to damage control, from negotiating lucrative deals to preventing complete financial ruin. The train seemed like the safest option for travel, a way to get to Atlanta without the risk of another driving incident that would inevitably end up on the front page of every entertainment magazine in the country. The media had been circling like vultures for months, waiting for the next scandal, the next public embarrassment that would provide content for their gossip columns and celebrity news programs. Randy had become accustomed to being portrayed as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly success could turn to failure. As he packed his guitar case that morning, the weight of the instrument seemed heavier than usual, as if it too was reluctant to face the world outside. The guitar was a 1985 Martin D28, a gift he had bought for himself after his first #1 hit, on the other hand, had climbed to the top of the country charts. It had been his companion through countless recording sessions, tours, and private moments when music was the only thing that made sense in his chaotic life. The instrument had aged beautifully, its spruce top developing a rich patina from years of playing, its sound becoming warmer and more resonant with time. Every scratch and ding on the guitar told a story. There was the mark from when he had accidentally bumped it against a microphone stand during a live television performance in 1987. Another small dent commemorated the time it had fallen from its stand backstage at the Houston Astrodome during his tour in 1989. The guitar had been witness to his greatest triumphs and his most devastating failures. And now, as he placed it carefully in its worn leather case, he wondered if this might be one of the last times he would carry it professionally. The journey to the train station was a quiet one, his friend James driving him in uncomfortable silence through the familiar streets of Nashville. They had known each other since Randy's early days in the city, when dreams seemed attainable and the future looked bright. James had started as his guitar tech, responsible for tuning instruments and setting up equipment before shows. Over the years, he had become much more than an employee. He was Randy's drinking buddy, his confidant, and eventually one of the few people who stuck around when the spotlight dimmed and the crowds disappeared. James had watched Randy's rise and fall with a mixture of admiration and concern. He had been there for the Grammy wins and the platinum albums, but he had also been there for the missed rehearsals and the increasingly erratic behavior. Now, as he drove his old friend to the train station, James could see the toll that years of struggle had taken. Randy's shoulders were slumped in defeat, his eyes avoiding contact with anyone who might recognize him, his entire demeanor radiating the kind of resignation that comes from too many disappointments. The drive through Nashville was a journey through Randy's personal history. They passed the recording studios where he had crafted his biggest hits, the venues where he had performed to sold-out crowds, the restaurants where he had celebrated contract signings and award nominations. Each familiar landmark served as a reminder of better times, when Randy Travis was not just a name, but a brand. When his voice on the radio could make or break a songwriter's career. The Nashville Union Station was a beautiful building, a testament to the city's rich history and its connection to the transportation networks that had helped shape American culture. The architecture was a blend of Romanesque revival and Richardsonian Romanesque styles, with its distinctive clock tower and ornate stonework speaking to an era when train travel was the height of sophistication and luxury. Randy had passed the building countless times over the years, but had never actually used it for its intended purpose. The station was busier than expected for a Tuesday afternoon, filled with a diverse cross-section of travelers. Business people in sharp suits clutched briefcases and talked urgently into cell phones, their conversations a mixture of corporate jargon and personal concerns. Families with young children struggled with oversized luggage and strollers, the parents looking simultaneously excited about their journey and exhausted by the logistics of traveling with kids. College students lounged in groups, their backpacks and casual clothes suggesting spring break trips or visits home to family. Randy pulled his baseball cap low over his eyes and hoped to blend into the crowd, but he was acutely aware that his face had been on magazine covers and television screens for decades. Even in his current diminished state, there was always the possibility that someone would recognize him and either approach him with sympathy or, worse, with mockery. He had become skilled at reading people's expressions, at identifying the moment when recognition dawned and deciding whether the encounter would be positive or negative. The train itself was a silver snake of metal and glass, modern but not luxurious, designed for efficiency rather than comfort. The Amtrak Crescent Line had been running between New York and New Orleans since 1979, with stops in major southeastern cities, including Atlanta. Randy had not traveled by train since his childhood in North Carolina, when his family would take the occasional trip to visit relatives in other parts of the state. Those journeys had been adventures, opportunities to see the countryside and experience the rhythm of rail travel. The memory of those simpler times, when his biggest worry was whether he would be allowed to sit by the window, felt like a lifetime ago. His family had been poor but loving, living in a small house in Marshville where his father worked construction and his mother took in sewing to make ends meet. Music had been their escape and their entertainment, with family gatherings often turning into impromptu concerts where everyone was expected to contribute a song or a story. Now, as he climbed the steps into the passenger car, Randy felt like he was entering another world entirely, one where his fame meant nothing and his problems followed him regardless of the mode of transportation. The car was filled with the sounds of modern travel, cell phone conversations, the clicking of laptop keyboards, children asking endless questions about their destination, and the general hum of people in transit. The train car was nearly full when Randy found his seat, a middle row that offered little privacy, but was all that remained available when he had booked his ticket at the last minute. The online reservation system had not recognized his name or offered him any special treatment. Another reminder that his celebrity status had faded to the point of irrelevance. He settled into the worn fabric seat, noting the small stains and tears that spoke to thousands of previous passengers who had made this same journey. Randy placed his guitar case carefully in the overhead compartment with the reverence of someone handling a sacred object. The case itself was showing its age, with scratches and scuff marks from years of travel, hotel rooms, and backstage areas. Inside, nestled in red velvet that had faded to pink in places, was not just an instrument, but a repository of memories, dreams, and the essence of who he had been before the world became too complicated. The other passengers were a mixed group that seemed to represent a cross-section of American society. Directly across the aisle sat an elderly couple, probably in their 70s, who were sharing a crossword puzzle and a thermos of coffee that filled the air with the rich aroma of a dark roast. The man wore a veteran's cap that indicated service in Vietnam, while the woman had the kind of carefully styled gray hair that suggested weekly visits to a beauty salon. They moved with the comfortable synchronization of people who had been together for decades. Behind them, a young mother was traveling with her restless toddler, a boy who appeared to be about 3 years old and was already showing signs of the restlessness that comes with confined spaces and long journeys. The mother, who looked to be in her late 20s, had the tired but determined expression of someone managing parenthood largely on her own. Her luggage included a diaper bag, a stroller, and enough snacks and toys to keep a small child occupied for several hours. Several rows ahead, a group of business people were absorbed in their laptops and cell phones, their conversations revealing discussions about quarterly reports, client meetings, and the kind of corporate concerns that drove the American economy. They were dressed in the uniform of professional success, tailored suits, expensive shoes, and accessories that spoke to comfortable salaries and ambitious career goals. Near the front of the car, a group of college students had claimed several seats, their excitement about their destination evident in their animated conversations and frequent laughter. They appeared to be from a southeastern university, based on the sweatshirts and bumper stickers visible among their belongings. Their youth and optimism provided a stark contrast to Randy's current state of mind, reminding him of his own early days in Nashville when everything had seemed possible. Randy tried to make himself as invisible as possible, pulling out a paperback novel he had grabbed from his nightstand without really looking at the title. The book turned out to be a thriller by John Grisham, something he had probably purchased years ago but never found time to read during his busier days. He pretended to focus on the words while actually watching the Nashville skyline disappear through the window, replaced by the rolling hills and farmland of Middle Tennessee. The landscape outside the window was familiar yet distant, like looking at photographs of a place he had once lived but could no longer call home. He saw farmhouses and barns that looked like they had been standing for generations, pickup trucks parked in gravel driveways, and tractors working fields that stretched to the horizon. These were the images he had sung about for decades, the symbols of a simpler life that he had never actually lived but had always yearned for in his music. The visual vocabulary of country music was all there. Weathered fence posts, cattle grazing in green pastures, old churches with white steeples, and the kind of two-lane roads that had inspired countless songs about journeys, homecomings, and the search for something better. Randy had built his career on these images, crafting songs that celebrated rural values and small-town virtues. But now, seeing them through the train window, he felt like an observer, rather than a participant in the culture that had made him famous. As the train gained speed and settled into its rhythm, Randy found himself remembering the early days of his career, when he had driven these same roads in a beat-up pickup truck, playing small clubs and honky-tonks throughout the South. Those had been difficult times financially, but they had also been exciting in a way that his later success had never quite matched. There had been a purity to those performances, a direct connection between artist and audience that had been lost somewhere in the machinery of commercial success. The rhythm of the train on the tracks was hypnotic, a steady beat that reminded him of the metronome he had used when first learning to play guitar as a teenager. His mother had insisted on music lessons, scraping together the money for a used guitar and weekly sessions with the choir director at their local Baptist church. Those early lessons had been the foundation for everything that followed, teaching him not just technique, but discipline and the importance of practice. For a moment, Randy allowed himself to relax into the comfortable motion of the train, thinking that perhaps this journey would pass without incident. The anonymity of public transportation felt almost liberating after years of being recognized everywhere he went. Here, surrounded by strangers focused on their own destinations and concerns, he could almost forget about his problems and simply exist as another passenger on a Tuesday afternoon train. The trouble began about 2 hours into the journey, as the train crossed into Alabama, and the afternoon sun began to slant through the windows at a different angle. The landscape had changed from the rolling hills of Tennessee to the flatter terrain of northern Alabama, with cotton fields and pine forests replacing the horse farms and music industry landmarks of Nashville. Randy had been dozing fitfully, lulled by the train's motion and the warm sunshine streaming through his window. One of the college students, a young man who appeared to be in his early 20s with an oversized personality and a clear need for attention, had been growing increasingly loud and disruptive. His name, Randy would later learn, was Tyler, and he was a junior at Auburn University majoring in business with plans that seemed to change depending on his audience and his blood alcohol level. Tyler had been drinking despite the early hour, pulling cans of beer from a cooler his group had brought aboard, and his friends were either too intimidated or too amused to rein him in. Tyler's behavior was becoming more aggressive with each passing mile, as if the alcohol was stripping away whatever social inhibitions he might have possessed. He had started by making loud comments about the other passengers, critiquing their appearance and behavior with the kind of casual cruelty that young people sometimes mistake for humor. His friends laughed nervously at his observations, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to confront him directly. The young man's attention span seemed limited, jumping from target to target like a predator testing different prey. He made comments about the elderly couple's old-fashioned clothes, mocked the business traveler's serious expressions, and suggested that the young mother's child was poorly behaved. Each comment was delivered with a smirk and a glance at his friends to ensure his performance was being appreciated. Tyler's eyes eventually landed on Randy, and something about the older man's attempt to remain inconspicuous seemed to trigger his worst instincts. Perhaps it was the way Randy was dressed, in jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days, or perhaps it was the careful way he held himself, as if he was afraid of drawing attention. Whatever the reason, Tyler seemed to identify Randy as a target, someone who would not fight back and therefore safe to torment. The remarks started quietly, shared with his friends in voices that were just loud enough for Randy to hear, but not so loud as to attract the attention of the entire car. Tyler made comments about Randy's appearance, suggesting that he looked like someone who had fallen on hard times, someone who probably could not afford to fly and was reduced to taking the train like a common laborer. His observations were delivered with the kind of casual cruelty that can only come from someone who has never experienced real hardship himself. Tyler's friends laughed uncomfortably at his observations, clearly aware that their companion was crossing social boundaries, but unsure how to stop him without becoming targets themselves. The group dynamic was familiar to anyone who had observed bullying behavior. One aggressive individual surrounded by enablers who were too weak or too afraid to intervene. The alcohol had clearly loosened Tyler's inhibitions and sharpened his cruelest instincts. Randy could feel the familiar burn of humiliation rising in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced countless times over the past few years as his personal struggles became public entertainment. The sensation was like acid in his stomach, a combination of anger, shame, and helplessness that made him want to either fight or flee. He tried to focus on his book, but the words blurred together as Tyler's voice grew more aggressive and his comments more pointed. The protagonist of the novel seemed to be facing his own challenges, something about corporate corruption and legal conspiracy, but Randy found it impossible to concentrate on fictional problems when his own very real humiliation was unfolding around him. The words on the page might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the meaning they carried in his current state of mind. Other passengers began to notice the situation developing around them. The elderly couple stopped their crossword puzzle to glance nervously in Randy's direction, their expressions showing disapproval of Tyler's behavior, but also uncertainty about whether they should intervene. They had lived through enough decades to understand that confronting aggressive young people could escalate situations in unpredictable ways. The business travelers looked up from their screens with expressions of discomfort and disapproval, clearly wanting the disruption to end but reluctant to become involved in a confrontation that might delay their journey or complicate their day. Their body language suggested the kind of professional detachment that urban dwellers often develop as a survival mechanism in public spaces. The young mother pulled her child closer, sensing the tension in the air and trying to shield the toddler from the ugliness that was beginning to unfold. Her maternal instincts were clearly activated, recognizing a potential threat to the peaceful environment she was trying to maintain for her son. The child seemed to sense his mother's anxiety and became more restless, requiring more of her attention and energy. Randy felt trapped, surrounded by strangers who were witnessing another moment of his degradation. The train car, which had seemed like a refuge from the outside world when he first boarded, now felt like a prison where he was being held captive for the entertainment of others. The walls seemed to close in around him, and he found himself thinking about his house in Nashville, empty though it was, and wishing he had never left its protective isolation. He considered getting up and moving to another car, but his guitar case was in the overhead compartment, and retrieving it would only draw more attention to himself. The thought of asking Tyler to move so he could access his belongings was unbearable, as it would require acknowledging the young man's presence and potentially escalating the confrontation. Randy was stuck, forced to endure whatever humiliation Tyler wanted to heap upon him. Tyler's harassment reached a new level when he began openly mocking Randy's appearance and making crude jokes about older people who could not afford to fly. He suggested that Randy looked like a down-on-his-luck musician, someone who had probably never made it beyond playing in local bars and honky-tonks. The irony of this observation was not lost on Randy, but it also made the mockery more painful because it contained just enough truth to sting. Tyler's performance became more elaborate as he gained confidence and alcohol. He stood up in the aisle, affecting an exaggerated Southern accent, and pretending to play an invisible guitar while making up lyrics about old men who rode trains because they could not afford cars. His friends laughed more loudly now, emboldened by their companion's brazenness, and perhaps influenced by their own consumption of alcohol. The laughter felt like physical blows to Randy, each chuckle adding to his humiliation and making him feel smaller and more insignificant. He had experienced criticism before, negative reviews and harsh comments from music industry professionals, but there was something particularly cruel about being mocked by someone young enough to be his son, someone who clearly had no idea who he was or what he had accomplished. The elderly man across the aisle, whose name was Robert, had been watching the situation develop with growing concern and anger. He was a veteran of the Vietnam War, someone who had seen enough cruelty and injustice to recognize it when it appeared in civilian life. His wife Margaret was gently restraining him, sensing his desire to intervene but worried about the potential consequences of confronting someone who was clearly intoxicated and unpredictable. Robert had grown up in an era when respect for elders was considered a fundamental virtue, when treating strangers with basic courtesy was expected rather than exceptional. The behavior he was witnessing violated every principle he had been taught about how people should treat each other, and his military training had instilled in him a deep aversion to bullying in any form. Tyler's performance reached its crescendo when he suggested that Randy looked like a has-been country singer, someone who probably used to think he was something special, but had been reduced to riding the train with regular people. He made exaggerated gestures and affected a mock Southern accent, imitating what he imagined a country singer might sound like. His performance was cruel and accurate in ways that he could not have known, and the laughter that followed felt like a knife being twisted in Randy's chest. The irony was devastating. Tyler was mocking Randy for being exactly what he actually was, but in a way that highlighted not just his current circumstances but the distance he had fallen from his former heights. The young man's casual dismissal of country music and the people who made it reflected a broader cultural prejudice that Randy had encountered throughout his career. The assumption that country music was somehow less sophisticated or valuable than other genres. Randy's hands trembled as he gripped his book, fighting the urge to either flee or fight back. Part of him wanted to stand up and confront his tormentor, to reveal his identity and shame Tyler into silence. But another part of him, the part that had been broken by years of public failure and private struggle, simply wanted to disappear. He had become so accustomed to being the object of ridicule that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to defend himself. The other passengers' reactions to the escalating situation varied widely, creating a complex social dynamic within the confined space of the train car. Some seemed embarrassed by Tyler's behavior and looked away, not wanting to be associated with the cruelty they were witnessing. Their discomfort was evident in their body language, the way they shifted in their seats and avoided eye contact with either Tyler or Randy. Others watched with the morbid curiosity of people observing a car accident, unable to look away from the spectacle even though they knew it was wrong. These passengers seemed torn between entertainment and guilt, fascinated by the drama unfolding around them, but aware that their voyeurism made them complicit in Randy's humiliation. A few seemed genuinely distressed by what they were seeing, their faces showing sympathy for Randy and anger at Tyler. These were the people who still believed in basic human decency, who understood that what they were witnessing was wrong regardless of who Randy was or what his circumstances might be. Their discomfort with the situation was evident, but they seemed unsure about how to intervene without making things worse. The breaking point came when Tyler decided to physically approach Randy, emboldened by alcohol and the laughter of his friends. He stumbled slightly as he moved down the aisle, his balance affected by both the train's motion and his intoxication. When he reached Randy's seat, he leaned down close enough that Randy could smell the beer on his breath and see the cruelty in his bloodshot eyes. Tyler began to make personal comments about Randy's appearance, his clothes, and his obvious attempt to remain invisible. He suggested that Randy looked like someone who had given up on life, someone who was probably running away from his problems rather than facing them like a man. The comments were designed to provoke a response, to goad Randy into either defending himself or retreating further into his shell. But then something unexpected happened that would change the entire trajectory of the journey and the lives of everyone involved. Robert, the elderly veteran, could no longer contain his outrage at what he was witnessing. Despite his wife's attempts to restrain him, he stood up slowly, his weathered hands gripping the seat back for support. He was probably in his mid-70s, with silver hair and the kind of face that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and simple values. Robert's voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried the authority of someone who had lived through enough to understand the weight of human dignity. He had served his country in a war that had tested his courage and his character, and he had returned home with a deep appreciation for the freedoms that allowed people to travel peacefully without fear of harassment or intimidation. He addressed Tyler directly, his words measured and deliberate, speaking with the kind of moral authority that comes from a lifetime of treating others with respect. He told the young man that his behavior was unacceptable and that he was embarrassing not just himself, but everyone who had to witness his cruelty. He spoke about the importance of treating others with respect, regardless of their circumstances, and suggested that Tyler would be ashamed of his actions when he sobered up and reflected on what he had done. Robert's intervention was not angry or aggressive, but it was firm and unwavering. He had faced enemy fire in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and he was not about to be intimidated by a drunk college student on a train. His words carried the weight of moral conviction, and they seemed to fill the entire train car with their quiet power. The intervention created a moment of silence in the car, a pause that seemed to hang in the air like a held breath. Tyler, caught off guard by the confrontation, seemed uncertain about how to respond to someone who was clearly not intimidated by his behavior. The dynamic of the situation had suddenly shifted, with Tyler no longer the aggressor, but the one being called to account for his actions. Randy felt something shift inside him as well, a recognition that he was not alone in this moment, that there were still people in the world who understood the importance of basic human decency. Robert's courage in standing up to Tyler had created an opportunity, a moment when the situation could be transformed from one of cruelty to one of redemption. Margaret nodded in support of her husband, and Randy noticed that several other passengers were also looking at Tyler with expressions of disapproval and disappointment. The social dynamic in the car had changed completely, with Tyler now isolated in his cruelty, rather than supported by the passive complicity of the other passengers. Tyler tried to deflect with more humor, but his jokes fell flat in the changed atmosphere of the train car. His friends were no longer laughing, and several of them looked embarrassed by their association with him. The young man found himself facing the disapproval of strangers who had witnessed his behavior and found it wanting. And for the first time since the harassment began, he seemed uncertain about his next move. Randy watched this transformation with growing awareness that the situation was presenting him with a choice that would define not just this moment, but possibly the rest of his life. He could continue to be the victim of Tyler's need to feel superior, accepting the role of the defeated has-been that had been thrust upon him. Or he could find a way to reclaim his dignity and perhaps even touch the hearts of the strangers who were witnessing his lowest moment. The decision that formed in Randy's mind was not calculated or strategic. It came from a place deeper than conscious thought, from the part of his soul that had always turned to music when words failed him. Music had been his refuge throughout his life, the place he went when the world became too complicated or painful to navigate with mere conversation. Now, in this moment of crisis, he felt the familiar pull of his instrument and the songs that lived within it. Randy's decision to retrieve his guitar from the overhead compartment was not planned or rehearsed, but it felt as inevitable as breathing. The movement came from an instinct that had been dormant for months. The same instinct that had once driven him to write songs in the middle of the night and perform them with a passion that transcended entertainment. His hands were steady as he stood up, his earlier trembling replaced by a sense of purpose that surprised even him. The other passengers watched with curiosity as Randy reached for his guitar case, their attention now focused on him, not as an object of mockery, but as someone who was about to do something significant. Even Tyler seemed intrigued, his aggressive posture softening slightly as he tried to understand what was happening. The train car grew quiet in a way that felt almost reverent, as if everyone sensed that they were about to witness something important. As Randy opened his guitar case, the familiar smell of leather and wood polish filled his nostrils, bringing back memories of countless recording sessions, rehearsals, and performances. The instrument itself was beautiful, its spruce top aged to a golden honey color that seemed to glow in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the train windows. Its mahogany back and sides bore the patina of years of use, the kind of wear that only comes from thousands of hours of playing and the natural oils from human hands. This guitar had been with him through his greatest triumphs and his most devastating failures, and now it felt like his oldest and most trusted friend. The weight of it in his hands was familiar and comforting, a physical connection to the part of himself that had never been diminished by public failures or personal struggles. As he settled the instrument across his lap, Randy felt a connection to his authentic self that he had not experienced in months. The process of tuning his guitar in the train car was different from tuning it in a recording studio or on a concert stage. Here, surrounded by strangers and with no sound system or stage lights, the simple act of adjusting the strings felt intimate and personal. The small sounds of tuning, the gentle plucking of strings, the subtle turning of tuning pegs, seemed amplified in the quiet car, creating a sense of anticipation that was almost electric. Randy's hands, which had been trembling with humiliation just minutes before, steadied as they wrapped around the familiar neck of the guitar. The muscle memory of thousands of hours of practice took over, and he felt his fingers find their proper positions on the fretboard with the kind of automatic precision that comes from decades of experience. The calluses on his fingertips, built up over years of playing, felt the strings with the sensitivity of a surgeon's touch. As Randy began the final adjustments to his tuning, the train car grew quiet in a way that was almost reverent. The normal sounds of travel, conversations, electronic devices, the rustle of papers and magazines, faded away as the passengers turned their attention to the man who had been the target of mockery just minutes before. Even Tyler stopped his commentary, curious about what was happening and perhaps beginning to sense that he had misjudged the situation entirely. The atmosphere in the car had transformed completely. Where there had been tension and cruelty, there was now anticipation and possibility. The other passengers seemed to sense that they were about to witness something special, something that would transform their ordinary train journey into something memorable and meaningful. The quality of attention in the car was different from anything Randy had experienced in years of performing. more focused and genuine than the polite applause of concert audiences or the manufactured enthusiasm of television appearances. Randy looked around the car at the faces of his impromptu audience, seeing not the strangers who had witnessed his humiliation, but human beings who were capable of connection and understanding. The elderly couple watched with expressions of gentle encouragement, their own long lives having taught them to recognize authenticity when they encountered it. The young mother had settled her child in her lap, both of them quiet and attentive. Even the business travelers had put away their devices, giving Randy their full attention in a gesture of respect and curiosity. The song that came from Randy's guitar was not one of his famous hits like Forever and Ever, Amen, or On the Other Hand. Those songs belonged to a different time in his life, when he was young and confident, and the world seemed full of possibilities. They were polished productions, crafted for radio play and mass consumption, perfect in their own way, but perhaps too removed from his current reality to serve his present purpose. Instead, Randy chose something more personal and immediate, a song that spoke to his current situation and the journey he had taken, from success to failure to whatever this moment might become. The melody was simple, but haunting, built around a basic chord progression that allowed the emotion of the performance to take precedence over technical complexity. It was the kind of song that spoke directly to the heart without needing elaborate production or flashy presentation. The lyrics, when Randy began to sing, were about dignity in the face of humiliation, about finding strength when the world seemed determined to break you down. They spoke of small towns and broken dreams, of men who had loved and lost and loved again, of the quiet courage required to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. The words were not complex or clever, but they were honest in a way that cut through all pretense and artifice. Randy's voice, when he began to sing, was different from the polished sound that had made him famous decades earlier. It was rougher now, weathered by years of struggle and disappointment, but it also carried a depth of emotion that his younger self had never possessed. The pain was audible in every note, but so was the resilience that had allowed him to survive his darkest moments. His voice carried the weight of experience, the kind of hard-earned wisdom that could only come from living through both triumph and devastation. The song he chose was one he had written years ago but never recorded, a deeply personal piece about redemption and second chances that had always felt too raw, too vulnerable for commercial release. The melody was haunting and simple, built around a progression that allowed his voice to carry the emotional weight of the lyrics. As he sang about falling down and getting back up, about finding light in the darkest places, his voice grew stronger and more confident with each verse. As Randy continued to sing, something magical began to happen in that train car. The hostile atmosphere that had been created by Tyler's cruelty began to transform into something else entirely. The music seemed to reach into the hearts of the passengers, touching places that had been closed off by the cynicism and callousness of modern life. The melody wrapped around them like a warm embrace, creating an intimacy that transformed the public space into something sacred. The elderly couple, Robert and Margaret, listened with tears streaming down their weathered faces. They recognized in Randy's voice the echoes of their own struggles and triumphs over the course of their 52-year marriage. The song spoke to them of the times they had faced financial hardship, family crises, and the thousand small heartbreaks that come with a long life. Margaret reached for Robert's hand, squeezing it tightly, as Randy's voice carried them back to their own moments of despair and recovery. Robert thought of his return from Vietnam, when he had struggled to readjust to civilian life and normal relationships. There had been nights when he had sat on his front porch with his own guitar, playing simple melodies and trying to make sense of everything he had seen and done. Randy's performance reminded him of those moments of healing, when music had been the bridge between his broken past and his hopeful future. The young mother, Sarah, found herself humming along to the melody, her 3-year-old son quieted by the gentle sound and the peaceful atmosphere that had replaced the earlier tension. She thought of her own father, who had loved country music and had often played guitar on the front porch of their family home in rural Georgia. Randy's performance reminded her of those simpler times, when music was not just entertainment, but a way of connecting with others and expressing emotions that could not be spoken aloud. Sarah had been traveling to Atlanta to meet with lawyers about her divorce, a painful process that had been dragging on for months. The journey had filled her with anxiety about the future, about raising her son alone and managing the financial pressures of single parenthood. But Randy's song spoke to her about resilience and hope, about the possibility of finding strength in the midst of uncertainty. Even the business travelers, who had been absorbed in their work and their digital devices, found themselves drawn into the performance. They put down their laptops and phones, giving Randy their full attention in a way that felt both respectful and grateful. The music seemed to strip away the barriers that normally existed between strangers, creating a temporary community united by their shared experience of witnessing something beautiful and authentic. One of the business travelers, a woman named Patricia who worked in corporate consulting, felt tears welling up in her eyes as Randy's voice carried her back to her own childhood in rural Tennessee. She had spent so many years climbing the corporate ladder, moving to cities and pursuing success, that she had almost forgotten her roots. Randy's performance reminded her of church services and family gatherings, where music had been the thread that held the community together. Tyler, the college student who had been the architect of the confrontation, found himself facing the reality of what he had done. As Randy's song continued, the young man began to understand that he had not been mocking some random stranger, but someone who had clearly lived through pain and found a way to transform it into something beautiful. The recognition of his own cruelty began to show on his face, replacing the earlier smugness with something that looked like shame and regret. Tyler's friends, who had been complicit in the earlier mockery, now seemed ashamed of their behavior and eager to distance themselves from their companion's cruelty. They watched Randy's performance with expressions of wonder and respect, clearly moved by the transformation they were witnessing. Several of them had grown up in small southern towns where country music was part of the cultural fabric, and Randy's authentic performance reminded them of their own roots and values. Randy's performance became more than just a song. It became a testimony to the power of art to transcend circumstance and connect human beings across all the barriers that normally divide them. His voice carried the weight of all his experiences, both triumphant and devastating. The passengers could hear in his singing the story of a man who had climbed to great heights, fallen to devastating lows, and was now finding his way back to something resembling peace and purpose. The vulnerability in Randy's performance was evident in every note, but so was the strength that had allowed him to survive his darkest moments. He was not hiding behind a persona or trying to impress anyone with technical skill. Instead, he was offering his authentic self, scars and all, to a group of strangers who had the choice to either accept or reject his gift. The courage required for such vulnerability was enormous, and the passengers seemed to recognize and honor it. The train continued its journey through the Alabama countryside, but inside the passenger car, time seemed to stand still. Randy's music created a bubble of intimacy and connection that transformed the space from a simple mode of transportation into something approaching sacred. The rhythm of the wheels on the tracks provided a subtle percussion that complemented the guitar, as if the train itself was participating in the performance. Other passengers from different cars began to appear in the doorways, drawn by the music that was drifting through the train. Word was spreading quietly through the other cars that something special was happening, and people were making their way toward the source of the beautiful sound. The conductor, making his rounds, paused to listen and found himself moved by what he was hearing. As the song reached its climax, Randy's voice soared in a way that reminded everyone in the car why he had once been one of country music's biggest stars. But more than that, it reminded them of the power of human resilience, of the ability to find beauty and meaning even in the midst of public humiliation and personal failure. The years of struggle and disappointment had not diminished his talent. They had deepened it, adding layers of experience and emotion that his younger self could never have accessed. The guitar work was masterful, not in a showy or technical way, but in its perfect service to the emotion of the song. Randy's fingers moved across the fretboard with the kind of unconscious precision that comes from decades of practice, creating melodies and harmonies that supported and enhanced his voice without ever overwhelming it. The instrument seemed to be an extension of his body, responding to his emotions as naturally as his own voice. When Randy reached the final verse of his song, his voice carried a note of hope that had been absent from his life for months. He sang about redemption and second chances, about the possibility of finding light even in the darkest places. The lyrics spoke of grace and forgiveness, both for others and for oneself, and the message seemed to resonate with every person in the car. The silence that followed the last note was profound, filled with the recognition that they had all witnessed something extraordinary. It was not the polished silence of a concert hall, where applause is expected and anticipated, but the stunned quiet of people who had been unexpectedly moved by an authentic display of human emotion. The passengers looked at Randy with new eyes, seeing not the broken-down man who had been mocked earlier, but an artist who had just given them a gift they had not known they needed. The transformation in the train car was immediate and complete. Where there had been hostility and mockery, there was now respect and admiration. The atmosphere had shifted so dramatically that it felt like a different space entirely, filled with warmth and human connection rather than cruelty and indifference. The passengers seemed to recognize that they had been part of something special, something that would stay with them long after the journey ended. Tyler, his earlier bravado completely deflated, approached Randy with tears streaming down his face. His apology was heartfelt and genuine, acknowledging not just his cruel behavior but his recognition of having encountered someone truly special. He spoke about his own struggles with alcohol and his tendency to lash out when he felt insecure, admitting that he had projected his own failures and fears onto Randy in a way that was both unfair and deeply wrong. The young man's transformation was remarkable to witness. The aggressive, mocking person who had tormented Randy earlier seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who was genuinely remorseful and eager to make amends. Tyler spoke about his own dreams of becoming a writer, his fears about failure and disappointment, and his recognition that he had allowed his insecurities to turn him into someone cruel and small. Randy listened to Tyler's apology with grace and compassion, recognizing in the young man's pain something of his own struggles with success and failure. He spoke quietly about the importance of treating others with kindness, not because they deserved it, but because everyone was fighting battles that others could not see. His words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, and Tyler listened with the intensity of someone receiving a life-changing lesson. The other passengers also began to approach Randy, but their approach was different from the celebrity encounters he had experienced in his heyday. There was no clamoring for autographs or selfies, no attempt to capture the moment for social media or personal gain. Instead, there was a genuine desire to connect with him as a human being, to share their own stories of struggle, and express their gratitude for his willingness to be vulnerable in front of strangers. Robert and Margaret, the elderly couple who had first intervened on Randy's behalf, were among the first to approach. Robert extended his weathered hand in friendship, introducing himself and his wife and expressing their honor at having witnessed such a powerful performance. They spoke about their own long marriage, the challenges they had faced together, and their admiration for Randy's courage in turning a moment of humiliation into something beautiful and meaningful. Margaret, with tears still glistening in her eyes, thanked Randy for reminding her of the power of music to heal and connect. She spoke about their own children and grandchildren, many of whom were fans of country music, and promised to share the story of this remarkable train journey with their family. Her words carried the warmth of a grandmother who had witnessed something precious and wanted to preserve it for future generations. Sarah, the young mother, approached with her son in her arms, the child now sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. She thanked Randy for the gift of his music and for the peace it had brought to her restless child. She spoke about the challenges of single parenthood and the way that unexpected moments of beauty, like Randy's performance, could sustain her through difficult times. Her gratitude was genuine and heartfelt, and it reminded Randy of the real purpose of his music, to provide comfort and connection to people who needed it most. Even the business travelers, initially reluctant to be drawn into the emotional drama, found themselves moved by the experience and eager to express their appreciation. Patricia, the corporate consultant, spoke about the pressure and stress of her job and the way that Randy's music had reminded her of the importance of staying connected to her authentic self. She thanked him for helping her remember her roots and the values that had shaped her before ambition and success had complicated her life. Another business traveler, a man named David who worked in financial services, said that he had never experienced anything like Randy's performance in all his years of travel. He spoke about the isolation of modern life and the way that Randy's music had created a sense of community among strangers. His words reflected the hunger that many people felt for authentic human connection in an increasingly digital and disconnected world. Randy felt a transformation within himself as well, a shift that was as profound as it was unexpected. The humiliation that had weighed so heavily on him just an hour before had been replaced by something he had almost forgotten: the joy of connecting with an audience through music. These strangers had become his congregation, and his guitar had become the instrument of his redemption. He realized that his worth was not determined by record sales or concert attendance, but by his ability to touch hearts and remind people of their shared humanity. The conversation that followed Randy's performance was unlike any he had experienced in his years as a professional musician. In the past, his interactions with fans had been largely superficial, brief encounters at meet and greets or signing events where the focus was on his celebrity status rather than his humanity. The conversations had been pleasant but formulaic, following predictable patterns of compliments and requests for photographs. But here, in this train car, the conversation was deep and meaningful, touching on themes of struggle, redemption, and the power of art to transform even the most difficult circumstances. The passengers shared stories from their own lives with a level of honesty and vulnerability that surprised everyone, including themselves. The music had created a safe space where people felt free to be authentic, to admit their struggles and fears without judgment. Randy found himself sharing stories from his own life that he had never told publicly before. He spoke about his childhood in North Carolina, growing up in a family that struggled financially but was rich in love and music. He talked about his father's work in construction and his mother's efforts to keep the family together through difficult times. He shared memories of family gatherings where everyone was expected to contribute a song or a story, creating a tradition of music and storytelling that had shaped his understanding of art's purpose. He talked about his early days in Nashville, when he was young and hungry and willing to do anything to make it in the music business. He shared the excitement of his first recording contract and the disbelief he had felt when his songs began climbing the charts. He spoke about the intoxicating feeling of success and the way it had opened doors he had never imagined could be opened. But Randy also spoke honestly about his failures, his struggles with alcohol and personal relationships, and the way that success had sometimes isolated him from the very people and experiences that had inspired his music in the first place. He talked about the loneliness of fame and the pressure to maintain an image that did not always reflect his true self. He shared the pain of watching his career decline and the shame he had felt as his personal struggles became public entertainment. The passengers listened with rapt attention, grateful for his honesty and moved by his willingness to be vulnerable. They seemed to understand that they were receiving a gift, not just the performance but the sharing of his authentic self. Many of them had their own stories of struggle and disappointment, and Randy's openness gave them permission to share their own experiences. Tyler, the college student whose cruel behavior had inadvertently set the entire experience in motion, stayed close to Randy throughout the conversation, clearly still processing his own transformation from antagonist to admirer. He asked Randy about his journey as a musician and listened with genuine interest to the stories of triumph and struggle. The young man's questions showed a newfound maturity and empathy that had been completely absent from his earlier behavior. Tyler spoke about his own dreams of becoming a writer and his fears about failure and disappointment. He admitted that his aggressive behavior often masked his own insecurities and his terror of not living up to his own expectations or those of his family. Randy encouraged him to pursue his passion while always remembering the importance of treating others with kindness and respect, regardless of their circumstances. The remainder of the train journey became a celebration of music and human connection that transformed what had started as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon into something extraordinary. Randy played several more songs, each one building on the emotional foundation established by his first performance. He played some of his classic hits, but also some newer material that reflected his current perspective on life and art. The passengers sang along when they knew the words and listened in respectful silence when they did not. The train car had become a temporary community, united by their shared experience of witnessing something beautiful emerge from something ugly. People who had been strangers just hours before were now sharing stories from their own lives, creating bonds that would last long after the journey ended. The college students who had been complicit in the earlier mockery now seemed ashamed of their behavior and eager to make amends for their earlier cruelty. Other passengers from different cars had heard about what was happening and made their way to witness the impromptu concert. The conductor, normally focused on schedules and tickets, found himself lingering to listen to Randy's music. Word spread quietly through the train that something special was taking place, and people gathered in the aisles and doorways to be part of the experience. As the train approached Atlanta, Randy felt a lightness he had not experienced in years. The city skyline, visible through the train windows, no longer seemed like a destination he was reluctant to reach, but rather a symbol of new possibilities and fresh beginnings. He had boarded the train that morning feeling like a man whose best days were behind him, but he was arriving as someone who had rediscovered his purpose and his power to touch lives through music. The goodbye process at the Atlanta station was unlike anything Randy had experienced in his years of public performance. There were no screaming fans or requests for autographs, no paparazzi or entertainment reporters documenting his every move. Instead, there was something even more valuable: genuine human connection, and the knowledge that he had made a difference in the lives of people who had needed to be reminded of their own dignity and worth. The passengers exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch and to remember the lesson they had learned about the power of kindness and the importance of treating every person with dignity. Many of them spoke about how the experience had changed their perspective on life and reminded them of values they had almost forgotten in the rush of modern existence. Tyler, now completely transformed from the antagonist he had been at the beginning of the journey, asked Randy if he could follow his music and perhaps attend a future performance. Randy, moved by the young man's sincere transformation, gave him his personal email address and encouraged him to pursue his own dreams while always remembering the importance of lifting others up rather than tearing them down. The exchange felt like a completion of the circle, a demonstration that even the most hostile situations could be transformed through courage and authenticity. Robert and Margaret invited Randy to visit them if he ever found himself in Atlanta again. They spoke about their own children and grandchildren, many of whom were fans of Randy's music, and promised to share the story of this remarkable train journey with their family. Their kindness and support had been a catalyst for Randy's transformation, and he would never forget their courage in standing up for him when he could not stand up for himself. Sarah thanked Randy once more for his music and for the peace it had brought to her and her child. She spoke about the challenges of single parenthood and the way that unexpected moments of beauty, like Randy's performance, could sustain her through difficult times. Her gratitude was genuine and heartfelt, and it reminded Randy of the real purpose of his music: to provide comfort and connection to people who needed it most. As Randy walked through the Atlanta station, guitar case in hand, he felt like a different person than the one who had reluctantly boarded the train in Nashville. The experience had reminded him that his value as a human being was not dependent on his commercial success or his ability to avoid public scrutiny. He was a storyteller, a creator of moments that mattered, a person capable of transforming pain into beauty and hostility into connection. The meeting with his lawyer that afternoon took on a different tone than Randy had expected. Instead of the defensive, apologetic conversation he had prepared for, Randy found himself speaking with confidence and clarity about his future plans. He was ready to return to music, not as someone trying to recapture past glory, but as someone who had learned to find meaning in smaller, more intimate connections with his audience. The train car had become his stage, and the performance had reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Marcus Reynolds, his lawyer, was surprised by the change in Randy's demeanor. The man who walked into his office that afternoon was different from the broken, defeated person he had been representing for months. There was a new confidence in Randy's voice, a clarity of purpose that had been absent for so long that Marcus had almost forgotten it existed. As Randy described his experience on the train, Marcus began to understand that something profound had shifted in his client's perspective on life and career. The phone call to his manager that evening was the first Randy had initiated in months. He spoke with a renewed sense of purpose, describing his experience on the train and his desire to begin performing again. His manager, who had been fielding calls from disappointed promoters and concerned record label executives for months, was surprised by the change in Randy's voice and encouraged by his apparent recovery. Randy's experience on the train became a turning point in his life and career, marking the beginning of a new chapter that would be defined not by commercial success, but by authentic human connection. He began to seek out smaller venues, intimate settings where he could connect with his audience on a personal level. The vulnerability he had shown that day on the train became a hallmark of his performances, creating experiences that were more meaningful than any stadium show had ever been. He had learned that true success was not measured by the size of the crowd or the amount of money generated, but by the depth of the connection between artist and audience. The train car had taught him that music's greatest power lay not in entertainment, but in its ability to touch hearts, heal wounds, and remind people of their shared humanity. The story of what happened on that train began to spread through the music community, not as another tale of a fallen star's humiliation, but as an inspiring account of redemption and the power of art to transform even the most difficult circumstances. Randy found himself not just performing again, but inspiring other artists who had faced their own struggles with failure and public scrutiny. His journey from that morning's despair to evening's renewed purpose became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of music. Years later, Randy would look back on that train ride as the day his real career began. Not the career of a young man trying to become famous, but the career of a mature artist who understood that the greatest performances were those that reminded people of their capacity for both cruelty and kindness, for both failure and redemption. The train car had become his classroom, and the lesson he learned there would inform every song he wrote and every performance he gave for the rest of his life. The legacy of that train ride would continue long after the last note of Randy's impromptu performance had faded. It became a story that people shared when they needed to remember that redemption was always possible, that dignity could be reclaimed, and that the power of music to heal and transform was greater than any force that sought to diminish the human spirit. Randy Travis had found his way back to himself on that train, and in doing so, he had shown everyone who witnessed it that they too could find their way back from wherever they had lost themselves.